we don't realize often is that food is one of the most concentrated industries in the world. And it's concentrated at two different levels. It's horizontally concentrated, that is to say, every subsector has got a few players who dominate that industry. But it's also vertically concentrated, that is to say, literally from farm to table. It is often one company that is organizing the entire thing and reaping benefits and profits out of every segment of that production or distribution. So whether it is from the inputs that enable cultivation or even the farm credit that is required for cultivation, on to the process of cultivation, the storage, the initial processing, the transport, the distribution, and finally the supermarkets and the retail. You find that major agribusinesses dominate this industry, particularly what are called the big four, A, B, C, D. That is Archer Daniels Midlands, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, who dominate the industry, and they dominate all the different segments of it. So whether you are a farmer, a small cultivator in a particular part of the world, or you're a final consumer in a different part of the world completely, you are somehow dependent on these corporations. One of the things that has happened as a result of this immense concentration is a real breakdown of the way in which people used to think traditionally about food. And that's especially in the rich countries, which is to say that we would think about food as being seasonal. Certain crops and certain fruit and vegetables would be available at particular times of the year. We would think of freshness as being a dominant concern. We would think of the availability not just in terms of year-round access and all the different types of food, but you would think of it in terms of local varieties. Now, that's no longer the case, especially in the advanced economies. Consumers are accustomed to strawberries year-round. They're accustomed to fish from every part of the world and animal products from every part of the world and vegetables of all kinds and fruit of all kinds available whenever they want. Now, there's something that is unnatural about this. And the way this is done is not only through massive storage and transport facilities, which are, of course, hugely carbon emitting, but also through ultimately undesirable ways of storing and encouraging particular types of consumption that often turn out to be quite unhealthy. So we are encouraging, and in fact, it's partly marketing by the major retailers as well. We are encouraging much more processed food consumption, which is much more unhealthy. We are encouraging the uses of additives, of preservatives, of different kinds of chemicals that are required to transport food over long distances, including fish and seafood and things like that. Many, many different ways we're encouraging unsustainable consumption. But then we're also encouraging unsustainable production because we're trying to maximize the productivity of the land, no matter what it does in terms of the chemical additives that we're using. We use chemical fertilizers, we use chemical pesticides, we use various kinds of additional inputs. We know that this has an impact on soil quality. We know that this can even have an impact on the product, on the crop, and can affect how healthy those are. But we keep doing more and more of that because we want to maximize the yield. And we're increasingly getting into genetic modifications, which are designed not only to sometimes avoid the chemicals, but more often to give you the perfect crop, the perfectly round red tomato, the perfectly shaped potato, the perfect egg, and so on and so forth. We're looking at different types of genetic modification that are designed to appeal to a very standardized consumer and to enable much greater preservation over long distances for transport. So all of these add up to really quite an unhealthy system of production and consumption. But it's also deeply unsustainable from the point of view of the planet. So it's unhealthy for both people and planet because, of course, it's massively carbon emitting, but it also erodes the soil. It also leads to lots of other kinds of concerns about the ecologies in which these plants are grown. To me, it represents a dilemma that is at the heart of so many of our policy decisions over the last couple of years, which is the dilemma between what we need to do in the medium and long term and what is the immediate short term kind of policy response. And in the case of fertilizers, we've had a dramatic increase in prices over the last few years, which is, of course, bad news because it affects especially small cultivators all over the world. Many of them are now finding it unaffordable to use fertilizers. And if you don't use them, that will affect yields, that will affect local food supply. So it's not just the livelihoods of farmers, but it's also the ability of many developing countries to produce the food that they need. All of that is affected. So how do you respond? And the immediate attempt is to respond by somehow reducing these prices or subsidizing fertilizers when countries can afford that. That's in a way counterproductive because, as I've said, fertilizers are part of a chemical input dependence, which is not really healthy, and where we really do need to be thinking of alternatives, and we have alternatives. It's just that those alternatives will take time, they will be more expensive, we need to invest a lot more in them. And instead of doing that, we quickly try and somehow manage the big increase in fertilizer prices. You know, the evidence is now mounting across the world that so many price increases of the last 2 years have been delivered by increasing profit margins. I mean, even the IMF has come up with a study now that more or less confirms this. When my colleague Isabella Weber mentioned this way back about 2 years ago, she was pilloried for making this argument. But now it's actually become accepted wisdom that the recent period is not one where supply shortages were the dominant reason for price increases. It's really that the news about possible supply shortages, whether because of COVID-related transport constraints, or because of the Ukraine war and the impact this might have on Russian and Ukrainian exports, was used by multinational corporations in energy and in grain. It was used by them to jack up their prices, basically increase their profit margins. So Russia is a major exporter of fertilizer. And even though it wasn't really that Russian supply was affected, it turns out now we have the evidence it wasn't affected. But major fertilizer companies could simply use this and say, oh, look, fertilizer is bound to be affected. So clearly the price is going up. And so they increased their profit margins from about, I think, 22% to as much as 36%. Dramatic increases in profits over sales. There are two issues here. And one is the fact that, as I mentioned, there's this contradiction between the short-term response and the long-term response. But the other is that, also you should be seeing these rising prices as a way of shifting production and consumption away from something that is essentially not desirable. And that is true of fossil fuels, and it is also true of fertilizers. In fact, as you know, a lot of fertilizers come out of fossil fuels. So there's a strong interdependence between the two. So yes, in the immediate case, what do you do? Well, I think there is a very strong case to do a windfall profit tax. And those windfall profit tax should be so high as to discourage attempts to just raise prices because you think you can get away with it, which is what's been happening over the past couple of years, really, for both the fossil fuel companies and fertilizer companies and a bunch of other corporations, really. But also a strong case in certain countries for price regulation, for saying, well, no, you can't really increase these prices because it's not justified by your cost increases. This is something that's been done not just in socialist countries, but it's been done in the United States in the wartime. I've been reading about Galbraith's price controls during and after the Second World War, for example. So it's possible to exercise price controls in sectors that are seen to be strategic, important, essential. But that leaves pending the larger question. Now, how do we then convert this broader problem into a possible opportunity? And you see, here is where agroecology, now there is so much scientific evidence that it is viable, it is doable, it is sustainable, it is desirable. In other words, there's really no good reason for not subsidizing and pushing and promoting agroecological techniques. What are those? Well, those are really techniques that rely much more on natural farming, not necessarily all organic, but certainly much more natural. So natural fertilizers, natural pesticides, much more local products, not things that are necessarily out of season or requiring special efforts to grow in particular areas. Things that can be produced seasonally and consumed as far as possible locally and not have to rely on being transported vast distances for export. Now, these techniques are, to begin with, more expensive. Why? Simply because they haven't benefited from all the massive subsidies that fossil fuels and fertilizers have got. So, when people say, oh, that's too expensive, they leave out the fact that both oil and fertilizer have benefited from decades of massive subsidies. And when I say massive, the official estimate of subsidies in 2020, before the Ukraine war and all of that, by the IMF, was about 700 billion, is the total amount of subsidies just going into fossil fuels. But if you take the indirect subsidies as well, it was 5.8 trillion. That's nearly 6 trillion. Can you imagine going into subsidies for fossil fuels? And of course, those subsidies make fertilizers cheaper as well. And in addition, many countries then further subsidize fertilizer. So we are actually making it much cheaper than it is. And then we're saying, oh, agroecology is too expensive. Whereas if we shift some of those subsidies away from fossil fuel and fertilizer to agroecological techniques, we will get healthier outcomes and more sustainable outcomes. So the shift away from chemical agriculture cannot be abrupt. It can't be something that you just do like that. It has to be a much more thought out, careful, sensitive transition. So for example, in Sri Lanka in 2021, they did this massive rejection of chemical fertilizer import. And that proved to be a complete disaster for the farmers in the country, for agricultural harvests in the country, for the economy. You can't do this kind of thing, which will dramatically affect farmers' ability to produce their yields and their incomes without providing some compensation and without easing it over a longer period. So this has to be a transition which you begin now. So the point is not to say, well, we will do this at some point in the future and we'll just suddenly do a big dramatic shift. No, the point is to say we start this year. We start this year by subsidizing, providing farmers with special subsidies if they are going to engage in agroecological practices. Some are saying continue subsidizing the chemical agriculture. Some are saying shift those subsidies to more sustainable practices and techniques. But all of them are saying that you have to keep farmers in mind when you're formulating policies about food. You cannot design policies for food consulting only with corporations. You have to talk to those who are actually producing the food. And I think it's that central point which governments miss and even international organizations miss. Our global food system broken because we have a pattern of consumption encouraged by this heavily concentrated agribusiness that I mentioned, which is deeply inequalizing, but it's also ridiculous because it encourages malnutrition. And malnutrition of both kinds, undernutrition and excess nutrition. That is to say, overconsumption, obesity, and all the illnesses that come with obesity. And that type of food consumption is being pushed by retailers who are parts of the same big nexus of agribusiness that I've mentioned, even in the developing world. So we now have crises of obesity, let's say in countries like South Africa. Often in some of the Pacific Islands, you have diseases, heart disease, diabetes, all kinds of things coming from the consumption of processed foods, from particular types of very fatty meat products that are pushed and encouraged and advertised by these global marketing agencies. And so you get all kinds of new illnesses coming because there is a push towards a certain kind of food consumption that is not just unhealthy. It doesn't really help in giving you better nutrition, but at the same time, it's very important for the profits of these major corporations. The rich in the developed world are now very conscious of this, and they eat healthy, and they eat organic, and they eat local, and they eat slow food, and they've got all of that. The poor in the US, on the other hand, eat more and more of the processed food. And they eat excessively large portions, which are again pushed by lobbies. And they eat much more fat and sugar-based processed foods, which are made cheaper than natural, healthier foods. Food has always been, at one level, it's central to human existence. At another level, it is deeply indicative of all the divisions of society and economy. So, access to food, it's not something that is necessarily universal. And access to different types of food, it's critically dependent on not just the total production or availability in any one country or globally. It's very much determined by class, by income, by the pattern of livelihood, by the kinds of social discrimination that enable access or lack of it. So the fact of extreme inequalities of income and assets, which we know have ballooned in the last decade, for example, or extreme inequalities of health and so on, all of these are also directly reflected in inequalities in access to food and inequalities in outcomes with respect to food. So, as I've mentioned, whether it is malnutrition because of undernutrition or malnutrition because of nutrition of the wrong kind, which gives you different kinds of diseases, all of these are very much reflective of the broader tendencies of inequality in our economies. I think there's a real problem in the way in which agribusiness and global media have work together to sort of make people feel that there is no alternative, that we have to have this pattern of production and consumption of food because that's the only way in which people will be fed. We now know that the food problem is ultimately one of distribution, and that there's surplus and excess and wastage. 40% of the food in the world is wasted, while huge amounts of people, billions of people in the world, are going hungry. And they're going hungry not just because of failure of global supply, they're going hungry because of local supply failures and because their livelihoods are not enough for them to be able to afford food in the poorer countries, which are affected, food importing countries, which are affected by exchange rate changes and economic distress and lack of employment. So we know that the causes of hunger are different. And yet we persist in thinking it's a problem of aggregate supply. It's not. Even today, the attempt to reform agriculture in Africa is unfortunately going in the wrong direction. It's led by an initiative called the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, which is really something driven by the major foundations and the Gates Foundation in particular, but has got the support of the World Food Summit. And AGRA is really pushing this chemical agriculture that I have been talking about. In fact, AGRA's own assessments and independent evaluations that they have commissioned all indicate that they haven't been successful. They haven't achieved their goals. That the so-called successes they have achieved, the minor increases in yields in a few countries and so on, are nowhere near their stated ambitions, and that in many cases they've actually made things worse, if not stagnant. So to push a chemical model of agriculture at this point in humanity, when we know that there are better alternatives available, is not just irresponsible. I think it's really counterproductive and it's going in absolutely the wrong way. The point about chemical fertilizers is not just that they are bad from the point of view of, say, CO2 emissions, which they are. I think they contribute about 2.4 of global emissions at the moment. They are very strongly related to the fossil fuel industry. A lot of the nitrogenous fertilizers come out of fossil as a byproduct of fossil fuel production. So again, it's very closely related to the whole carbon emission problem. But they also have a terrible impact in terms of farming itself. They lead to soil erosion, they lead to the degradation of the quality of the soil, they have implications for the quality of the output and the crops, and even for the health of the crops. So chemical agriculture is bad for the ecology, that is, it's bad for the local area, the land, the nature around it, and it's bad for human health. We embraced it across the world because it provided higher and higher yields. And we thought that that was essential for solving the food problem. We now know that it's not essential, that you can solve the food problem with sustainable yields using agroecological techniques. But because we are subsidizing chemical agriculture and chemical inputs so heavily, agroecological techniques are not seen as profitable or even competitive. So we have to shift. We have to shift our subsidies away from chemical agriculture towards more natural agriculture. One of the tragedies of our times is the extent to which multilateral fora have been taken over or manipulated or dominated by private commercial interests, and particularly by large multinational corporations who have not just lobbying power, but they have the ability to, shall we say, infiltrate many of these organizations. I think it's a tragedy in many sectors, but it's particularly a tragedy in the world food system. And the fact that even the World Food Summit relied heavily on sponsors who were private food corporations, and that so many of the big initiatives for changing agriculture rely on direct or indirect sponsorship from big corporations. I think that's very unfortunate. And of course, it makes it much harder for, shall we say, the voice of sanity to prevail. Because the voice of sanity would say, don't do this. Don't make mistakes which you don't need to make when you know that there are other options available. But the voice of profit is saying, well, go ahead and do this and we'll worry about the impact later. Because right now you'll get some benefits and we will get even bigger benefits. So countering that voice of profit is a tough call. But I do believe that there are more and more voices around this. As you mentioned, there are many people in different food sovereignty and farmer sovereignty movements around the world who are trying to make themselves heard, and there are many new initiatives coming up. But I do also believe that eventually these problems will become so severe and so telling that humanity will have no choice.
And of course, there's the Ukraine war and the subsequent impact on food and fuel prices. And this is now blamed. If you look at the mainstream press, everything is about the Ukraine war. That's what has destroyed the conditions for emerging markets. That's what has created all these terrible conditions. And so it's Russia's to blame for everything, or whatever you want to call it, but it's the Ukraine war which is responsible for the mess. There's no doubt that there have been massive food and fuel increases since the Ukraine war. But please note, these prices started rising well before. Blue line is energy, red line or orange line is food. The gray line is fertilizer, which is the other one that everyone talks about with respect to the Ukraine war. Okay, and yes, definitely there's a very, very significant increase. I don't know if you can see the numbers in war. But clearly prices had started rising. These major commodity prices had started rising well before then. No doubt about it, Ukraine war made things worse, particularly for oil or energy broadly and fertilizer. But these are only very partly related to the shocks themselves, to supply shocks. In fact, I'm going to argue that the supply shocks are almost marginal in the price increases, okay? The big changes have been massive profiteering by the big companies, big oil, big energy generally, big finance, of course. We saw big pharma during the pandemic, but big agribusiness. We have had massive increases in profits of agribusiness and of, in general, the big energy and agribusiness companies, to the point where in the US, it's been estimated that of the recent inflation, 54% of it is explained by profits. Only about 8% is explained by workers' wage increases. And the rest of it is the famous supply chain issues that everybody likes to talk about. But in fact, today, US corporate profits are at the highest level since the 1950s. And the last 1 year has seen the most rapid rate of growth of corporate profits since data began to be collected. And as once again, I'm emphasizing, it's concentrated in these sectors: in finance, in energy, in agribusiness, in pharma. These are the big four areas where you're seeing massive profit increases. But in addition, there's massive increase in speculative activity. So we're back in a way in the world where we were in 2007 to 2009, where we had a global food crisis driven almost entirely by speculation, in commodity futures markets. So there's a lot of interesting work done. The Paris wheat market, which is the benchmark for Europe, for example. Financial investors increased their open positions. In May 2018, they were only 23%. By May 2022, they were 72% of all the open positions. That's the kind of engagement of financial players. Similar stories from the Chicago Board of Trade. We find finance well and truly back into commodity futures and the commodity markets generally. Despite the Dodd-Frank law, which was supposed to prevent all of this, what really happened with the Dodd-Frank law is that while it says that everything should be in regulated exchanges and there shouldn't be over-the-counter transactions and so on, the ultimate way in which the regulations were enforced or the rules were laid down, especially during the Trump regime, raised the limits so significantly that pretty much everybody can now get into commodity futures. And they are indeed getting into those. So what's the interesting thing here is that the prices can go up very, very dramatically. Please look at the right-hand graph. And then they can come down again dramatically. So I'm not kidding when I say this is the same as 2007 to 2009. That's exactly what happened to the global wheat market then. Prices went up, more than doubled, and then came back to their previous levels. In the interim, developing countries faced massive food price increases. But in fact, when the global prices went down, it's not as if developing countries were better off. Because, first of all, their currencies had depreciated in that interim period of crisis. But secondly, also, there is this ratchet effect operating in many developing countries in terms of the food price. So this, you can say, oh, well, you went through a bad phase and you're back to where you were. Not true. You're not back to where you were. In developing countries, food prices remain significantly higher. I'm saying developing, it's such a habit, LMICs. You can't, okay, you can raise interest rates. It might control inflation, but it's obviously not going to do anything for expansion. If anything, it will create recession. And I'm not so sure big corporations are going to be happy with recessions. So a lot will depend on how big capital in the US and EU sees their own interests, whether they actually would prefer a control of inflation, even if moderate, as was mentioned in the morning, or they would prefer future possibilities of expansion. So I think this one, I don't know, I would welcome a discussion. I'm grappling with this myself, but I'm not so sure that it can be, this either or. But there is the other thing, which is, there is clearly global trade fragmentation. This happened well before the pandemic. It happened with Trump, really, and his sanctions on China and the need to find alternative routes, the reshoring, which became not just reshoring, but also finding alternative routes. And the possibility that you can't anymore rely on any one set of providers for any particular commodity. Now, does that in turn impact advanced economies, fiscal and monetary policies? Again, I think I'm not so sure how and in the different ways in which this would impact. But certainly it does mean that it would require us, LMICs, to generate alternative trajectories of trade, whether regional, bilateral, plurilateral, and alternative patterns of trade credit, alternative patterns of swaps, alternative patterns of financing as well. So I would argue that for the developing world, at least, to cope with this situation, the final point that people were making in the last session, I would say that it depends really on three big things. One is how much we can actually de-link from the current debt and financial arrangements, because many countries have legacy debt. A large part of it is private. You renege on your private debt or you default on it and you face all kinds of problems and sanctions and inability to access new credit in the official global credit markets. Perhaps it may not have the same impact in the new alternative arrangements that are being worked out as we speak with Russia, with China, with a bunch of other countries. How much can we rely on external capital? Not necessarily for anything else, but for the technologies. We really need technologies to deal with future health hazards, to deal with climate change at every level. We know we're not going to get the finance for it, but at least can we access the technologies for it? And finally, the thing that I said wasn't such a problem because we were back to where we were in 2012. But if terms of trade deteriorate further, then it will be even harder for us to do something that is of significance. But okay. And most global trade has been organized through SWIFT.
In fact, there are those who argue that, just as container technology was a critical technological input into globalization, it made the emergence of global supply chains possible because suddenly you could import and export larger quantities and volumes very cheaply. Similarly, SWIFT was, if you like, the financial equivalent of that. Now suddenly you're saying, well, it's only for my friends. If I decide I don't like you, you don't get access to SWIFT. That's huge. That's really saying that you cannot trust me for any of the things on which you have built your trade and financial patterns. So more and more countries are saying, well, we have to have a backup plan. The multilateral system as we know it is either powerless or ineffective or sometimes absolutely counterproductive. Let's admit it. Our institutions are not fit for purpose. They have to be massively revamped. Cooperation for finance, cooperation for technology and knowledge, cooperation for implementation. All of these are critical. We can't do it without cooperating.
Right.
And that seems to have gone. That to me, it's not just a tragedy, it's scary. I do believe that mainstream economics has been very much in the service of power. Okay, economics is about politics. It's about distribution. It is about how you organize production. All of these intimately related to power. And so it is unfortunate but true that mainstream economics has very much, and especially the neoliberal period, has very much followed the requirements and dictates of those who control power. That is why, in fact, it has been such a strict gatekeeper of alternative thinking. It really, the mainstream discipline it's absolutely killing to those who have alternative things. They will not get published in the so-called top journals. They will not get promoted or even get tenure in universities. They will not be allowed to teach the most basic economics courses. So there is a real tendency to keep economics into the straight and narrow, because it's seen as politically important. On the other hand, it's therefore further and further away from reality. Okay, and therefore you have a huge emergence of those who need to actually understand the economy, whether it is the people in business schools, because business needs to understand the economy, or it is students who say, well, listen, this is not why we came to study this. We didn't want to just do some funny little game theoretic model that has no bearing on what is happening in the world today, or a particular randomized trial in one little place in a poor country somewhere where I can get a cute little result. We want to understand the dynamics of the economy, the relationship between states and markets and societies. What is driving the big things that are happening in the world around us, whether it is an increase in employment, unemployment, inflation, the impact of climate change, the distribution. We want to understand those things. So there is more and more of a movement away from that very puerile, what had happened to economics at the mainstream discipline. There were always pockets. I was proud in my earlier university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where you're also an alumnus. I was very proud that our department maintained that tradition. I'm happy now at UMass Amherst that there is, again, a strong heterodox tradition, but I think there are more and more people who recognize that, listen, the point of studying this is to actually understand what's going on and to try and do something about it. It's not to just, be clever within a very small domain of equally clever people. Yet there is this clinging on to the idea that, yes, you can have so-called free markets, which are really markets. Neoliberalism is not about free markets. It's about markets serving large capital and states serving large capital. Yeah, but it's disguised as being about free markets. And therefore it is presented in that way. And that has got even stronger the more it becomes evident that it is absolutely not just irrelevant, but counterproductive.